They told you the American farmhouse was a symbol of honesty, a beacon of trust, faith, and family. But what if I told you that behind one wooden door, beneath the hymn-singing of Sunday mornings, a man engineered his own fortress of shadows, where his wife was poisoned, his daughter entombed, and a legacy of evil disguised itself as respectability? You were never meant to hear this story, because if you do, you will never look at your own family the same way again. In the autumn of 1911 in Greene County, Iowa, a man named Edward Hensley stood at the center of his community. He was respected, trusted, almost admired, a mechanic who could fix anything, a husband to Florence, a father to young Clara. To neighbors, he was the embodiment of the American ideal, hard-working, faithful, dependable. But beneath that mask lived something darker, something calculated, something ancient in its hunger for control. The first sign of corruption was invisible, a small dose of arsenic hidden in Florence's food. The community believed typhoid had taken her. Edward knew otherwise. He didn't just watch his wife die, he orchestrated it, suffocating her in the final hours when her frail body could resist no longer. Why? Because Florence had begun asking questions about his behavior with their daughter, questions that, if spoken aloud, could have shattered the fragile glass of his reputation. But this is not just the story of one man's depravity. It is the story of how institutions, church, community, even medicine can be manipulated by image. How corruption hides in plain sight, protected by the blind faith of neighbors who see only what they want to see. Edward understood that psychology. He weaponized it. By the time Florence's body was lowered into the ground, his deception was complete. The grieving widower, the loving father, the man who just needed to protect what was left of his family. But the truth was this. Edward wasn't protecting Clara. He was preparing her, not for freedom, not for life, but for an imprisonment so complete, so suffocating, that even God's own daylight could not reach her. And this prison wasn't built of iron bars. It was built of lies, obedience, and silence. Tools far older than any man. Imagine a man who knows that the key to control is not brute force, but perception. Edward Hensley did not need to roar to dominate. He only needed to convince his daughter that his smothering love was protection, convince his neighbors that his restrictions were grief, convince his community that he was the one man they could trust. This is how power works in the real world, not in the open, but in the shadows of appearances. After Florence's burial, Clara was still just a girl. 16, vulnerable, disoriented by the sudden death of her mother, and Edward knew that grief was a door, an opening into the mind. He slipped through it, cloaking his intentions in the language of devotion. "You're all I have left, Clara. I can't lose you too." These words, dripping with performance, were not a father's plea. They were the first locks on a cage. Step by step, the walls closed in. He escorted her to school, insisting she was not safe alone. He cancelled her plans to study, claiming the family needed her at home. He silenced her friendships, cutting ties to the outside world one by one, until her laughter, her dreams, even her presence in the community dissolved into nothingness. By the end of that first winter, Clara had vanished from public life, not with a scream, not with an abduction, but with the quiet suffocation of control. And the neighbors? They said nothing. They watched her absence stretch into weeks, then months, but believed his words because it was easier than suspecting evil. Isn't that the way society has always worked? We protect the illusion of goodness, even when it costs someone their life. We choose blindness because to see would mean admitting that monsters can look like men who sing hymns in church pews. But Edward was not blind. He was meticulous. While the community trusted his facade, he was down in the basement hammering, chiseling, forging. Stone walls restructured, iron door hand-forged, a ventilation shaft disguised as part of the chimney, every sound muffled, every escape route sealed. What he was building was not storage space, as he claimed. It was a tomb of the living, a secret chamber carved from the earth itself, designed to hold not tools, but a daughter. That is the most disturbing truth. Cages do not have to be public. The most powerful cages are the ones no one dares believe exist. It was March of 1913, and Edward had been waiting for this moment like a hunter waits for his prey. For nearly 2 years, he had labored in secret, chiseling stone, forging iron, calculating silence. The basement was no longer just a cellar, it had become a machine of captivity, an invention designed to erase a human being from the world without leaving a trace. And now, it was time to feed it. Clara was 17, still clinging to the fragments of childhood, still trusting the man she called father. That morning he woke her early, his voice strangely calm, almost tender. He told her he needed help moving a heavy door in the basement. She obeyed because disobedience had long been trained out of her. She obeyed because to resist a father's will in that time, in that community, was unthinkable. That obedience would be her undoing. She followed him into the dim light of the cellar, barefoot on cold stone. Oil lamps flickered against the walls, casting shadows that twisted and reached like phantoms. In the corner stood the heavy iron door, leaning against freshly built brick. It looked like nothing more than a renovation project, until she saw the opening behind it. A gap in the wall she had never noticed. A passage that should not exist. "Hold this end," Edward told her, pressing the edge of the door into her hands. And then, without hesitation, he struck. A rag, soaked in ether, smothered her mouth and nose. The world spun into blackness as her body went limp in his arms. When Clara awoke, the nightmare had begun. Stone walls pressed in around her, a small bed, a bucket, a narrow window so high she could barely see the soil above, and the iron door, sealed, impenetrable, with no handle on the inside. She screamed, pounded her fists, begged, but sound travels differently when walls are thick and the world refuses to listen. Her voice was swallowed whole by silence. Above ground, Edward rehearsed his next act. The grieving father whose daughter had run away in the night. To neighbors he told stories of a young seed salesman, of letters written from distant towns, of a daughter chasing dreams in secret. He even produced forged notes in her handwriting, lies crafted so carefully that even suspicion bent into sympathy. Down below, Clara wept until her throat bled. She prayed for rescue. She marked the stone with scratches, counting days that blurred into months. But what she did not yet know was this: her prison was not temporary. Edward had not built a cell to punish. He had built it to possess. Clara soon learned that the walls of her prison were not the cruelest part. It was the man who visited through the iron door, whose shadow filled the room before his voice did. Edward did not simply want her hidden. He wanted her reshaped. He fed her in silence, passed scraps of bread and bowls of broth through a hatch, but every meal came with a reminder. "The world has forgotten you, Clara. I am the only one who remembers." At first, she fought back. She begged him to let her go, screamed that she hated him, scratched her hands raw against the iron door until blood stained her nails. But Edward thrived on resistance. It was proof of her spirit, proof that she was still worth breaking. He responded not with rage, but with patience. He told her that no one was looking for her, that her friends whispered cruel things behind her back, that the neighbors believed she had chosen to disappear. Every word was a brick sealing her tighter into the belief that escape was not only impossible, but meaningless. Weeks became months. Time blurred into a haze of oil lamp flicker and suffocating silence. Clara began to dream with her eyes open, to hear voices in the ventilation shaft that weren't there. She started to believe Edward's lies, that she had been erased from memory, that the world moved on without her. This was the cruel genius of her father. He didn't just imprison her body, he imprisoned her mind. And yet, in the darkest corners of her confinement, a small ember of defiance still smoldered. Clara carved names into the stone wall, her mother's, her own, sometimes just words like freedom and light. They were faint, shallow scratches, but they were resistance. They were proof to herself that she had once existed outside this grave. proof that Edward had not yet erased her completely. Above ground, Edward's performance as the grieving father deepened. He wrote letters to local papers begging for information. He stood in church pews with tears staining his cheeks. He played the role of the faithful victim so perfectly that even suspicion would have felt like cruelty. The community did not see a monster. They saw a man still mourning, a man who prayed harder than anyone else for his daughter's return. And so, the lie became reality. Edward Hensley was no longer just Clara's captor. He was her world. By the second year of Clara's captivity, Edward's obsession had grown into something that was no longer merely control. It was ceremony. He no longer saw himself as just a father. He began to act like a priest presiding over a private religion, one in which Clara was both disciple and sacrifice. Every evening at the same hour, he entered the chamber with his oil lamp. He would force her to sit on the edge of the narrow bed while he spoke in a low, sermon-like tone. "The world is poison, Clara. Out there you would be destroyed. Here you are safe. Here you belong." Over time his words became mantras. He demanded that she repeat them over and over until they bled into her dreams. And when she resisted, when she tried to hold on to the fragments of her mother's memory, he punished her not with violence but with deprivation. He left her in darkness for days, with only water to drink, until hunger itself bent her spirit into obedience. This was Edward's true method: starvation, isolation, and repetition. He was not just keeping Clara hidden, he was rewriting her mind. Slowly she began to fear the outside world as much as he wanted her to. The thought of open air, of sunlight, became frightening, too bright, too vast. She began to cling to the chamber as if it were the only reality she could endure. That was the moment Edward knew he had succeeded. And yet, some nights, Clara still fought to remember who she was. She whispered prayers into the cracks of the stone. She imagined her mother's voice calling her name. She pressed her ear to the ventilation shaft, listening for sounds of life above. Sometimes she heard laughter drifting from neighbors' porches or the ringing of church bells on Sunday mornings. And each time, it broke her heart anew, because those sounds confirmed what Edward insisted was true. The world continued. The world had forgotten her. Meanwhile, Edward perfected his public mask. He volunteered at church, offered his mechanical skills to farmers, and even played the role of a man still waiting for Clara's return. To the community, he was a saint of patience and sorrow. To Clara, he was the architect of a prison disguised as protection. But there was something else beneath his rituals, something he never said aloud. For Edward, Clara was not only a captive, she was an heirloom, his possession, his creation, the one thing he could mold into a reflection of his will. And in that twisted reflection he believed he had achieved something greater than fatherhood. He believed he had created obedience itself. By the third year of her captivity, Clara had learned to hide her emotions. Outwardly she appeared obedient, reciting Edward's mantras, bowing her head when he entered, never raising her voice above a whisper. But inside, something dangerous was growing. Not hope, not faith. Something colder, something sharper. Revenge. She realized that open resistance only tightened Edward's grip. Screaming led to silence. Defiance led to hunger. But submission bought her time. Submission bought her strength. So she began to play the role Edward had written for her, mimicking the obedience he craved, even as her mind worked in secret against him. Clara started memorizing details, the exact hours of his visits, the way the hinges of the iron door groaned when he unlocked it, the rations he brought and how often, even the rhythm of his footsteps across the cellar floor. Each detail was stored, buried deep like seeds in the soil, waiting for the right season to bloom. But there was something else Edward never considered. In his arrogance, he believed that stripping Clara of freedom would strip her of power. He was wrong. Prisoners adapt. Prisoners learn to use what little they have, and Clara discovered her first weapon: patience. She could wait longer than him, suffer in silence longer than him, and when the moment came, when a weakness cracked through his routine, she would be ready. One night while he slept upstairs, Clara pressed her ear to the ventilation shaft. A storm raged outside. Wind howled, rain hammered the earth, thunder rattled the foundations of the house. And in the chaos, she heard something she hadn't in years. The bark of a neighbor's dog. It was faint, but it was enough to remind her of a truth Edward had tried to bury. The world still existed. It had not forgotten her. It simply could not see her. Hat was when her resolve hardened. If she could not escape, she would endure. If she could not endure forever, then she would outlast him. And if she could outlast him, she would one day make him pay. Above ground, Edward remained blind to her transformation. To him, Clara was now docile, pliant, his creation perfected. He believed his sermons had broken her spirit. He did not see the fire smoldering behind her eyes. He did not notice that each whispered prayer she spoke into the cracks was no longer for salvation. It was for vengeance. By the 4th year, Edward Hensley had grown comfortable in his deception. Too comfortable. Control had become routine, and routine breeds mistakes. He no longer double-checked the hatch when he delivered meals. He no longer lingered as long after his sermons, sometimes leaving the oil lamp burning too close to the vent, allowing Clara a few extra moments of dim, precious light. To him, these slips were meaningless. To Clara, they were cracks in the armor. She began to notice more than just his patterns. She noticed his aging, the way his hands shook when he held the lamp, the rasp in his breathing when he descended the stairs, the pauses in his speech when he searched for words. Edward was no longer the towering figure of authority he once seemed. Time was carving into him the same way he had carved stone for her cell. And Clara understood something vital. She had time, but he did not. One night, he left the hatch unlocked, just for a moment. Perhaps fatigue dulled his vigilance. Perhaps arrogance told him she was too broken to notice. But Clara noticed. Her fingers traced the latch after he left, trembling with the realization that freedom had been inches away. She did not try to open it. Not yet. She knew the sound of that hinge would wake him, but she memorized the movement, the weight, the cold metal against her skin. She was Lear, running her prison as if it were a map. And then came the second mistake. Edward had always rationed her food carefully, ensuring she was weak enough never to resist him physically. But one autumn, after slaughtering a hog for himself, he left scraps of fatty meat in her bowl. Clara hid half of it, wrapping the shreds in a piece of torn cloth. For the first time, she saved food. She was no longer surviving meal to meal. She was preparing. Her body grew leaner, stronger. She began pacing the chamber when he was gone, stretching her muscles, rehearsing in silence. Every scrape of her bare feet on stone was a rehearsal for a day she did not yet know. Above ground, Edward's facade was also slipping. Neighbors whispered about how rarely they saw him outside the house. Some wondered if grief had driven him into permanent isolation. But no one suspected the truth. No one knew that in the soil beneath their feet, Clara was waiting, watching, gathering strength from his mistakes. The walls still held her, but for the first time, Clara felt something she hadn't in years. Not freedom, but possibility. Clara's rebellion began so small that even Edward, meticulous as he was, did not notice. She had learned the art of invisibility, pretending to be broken, even while quietly gathering fragments of strength. Her first act was silence, not the silence of despair, but of strategy. When Edward delivered her meals and demanded her mantras, she spoke in flat tones, never revealing the fire simmering beneath. He thought he had extinguished her, but in truth, she was masking her spark until it became flame. The scraps of food she saved became her hidden lifeline. She tucked them into a crack in the wall, drying meat until it hardened, learning how long she could make it last. It was a dangerous game. If he discovered her cache, the punishment would be merciless, but he never did. Edward had grown too accustomed to believing she was incapable of thought. That arrogance was her shield. She also began to test the iron door. Each night, When the storm winds masked her movements, she pressed her weight against it, pushed her fingers into the hinges, studied the sound it made when it shifted. She knew she could not open it yet, but she wanted to understand its language, the groans of metal, the sigh of the lock, the way air whispered through the seam. Every sound was a clue. Every clue was a key. And then came her boldest act. Edward left a book one evening, an old Bible, expecting her to read it, to absorb his twisted sermons through its verses. But Clara used it differently. She tore thin scraps from the back pages and used a shard of stone to scratch markings onto them. She began keeping count, not just of days, but of his visits, his moods, his mistakes. It was the first written record of her resistance, the first proof that her mind, though caged, was still her own. But rebellion came with risk. One night, Edward noticed her hands trembling, her eyes sharper than usual. Suspicion flickered in him. He questioned her, pressing for confessions, circling like a predator who senses prey stirring beneath the soil. Clara held her breath, masking her terror with blank obedience. At last he left, muttering that she was weak, still broken. She had fooled him. Barely. Above ground, life in the community continued. Children were born, farms were harvested, families gathered for celebrations Clara could no longer imagine. And beneath it all, in her hidden chamber, Clara tested the bars of her invisible cage, not with noise, not with open defiance, but with the quiet persistence of someone who had decided one thing: she would not die here. By the 5th year, Edward's confidence had begun to erode. He had built his control on the certainty that Clara was broken, but deep down he knew captivity was a fragile thing. It required constant vigilance, constant performance. If even one thread unraveled, the entire mask could fall. And Edward had lived too long inside his own lies. Neighbors began asking questions again. A visiting preacher, unfamiliar with Edward's history, wondered aloud why no trace of Clara had ever been found. A store clerk noted that Edward rarely bought anything beyond what a single man might need. These whispers were not accusations, but they planted seeds of doubt, and Edward felt them. He started locking his doors earlier, closing his curtains tighter, keeping to himself in ways that only fueled suspicion. He told himself it was grief, but he knew it was fear. That fear followed him into the cellar. He began entering Clara's chamber at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, carrying his lamp like a watchman checking for breaches. He scoured the walls for marks, searched her bedding, even inspected her hands for scratches or hidden objects. Clara understood what was happening. He was paranoid, and paranoia, she realized, was not strength. It was weakness. The more he searched, the more mistakes he made. He left the hatch ajar longer. He fumbled with the keys. He even left behind a nail once. Small, bent, rusted, but metal nonetheless. Clara seized it the moment he was gone, hiding it beneath her mattress. To Edward, it was nothing. To her, it was everything. A tool, a symbol, proof that his control was slipping. But paranoia also brought cruelty. He began tightening her rations again, convinced hunger would keep her docile. He left her in darkness for days, certain that silence would erase her thoughts. What he did not realize was that these punishments no longer broke her. They hardened her. Every pang of hunger became fuel for endurance. Every hour of darkness became training for patience. Edward believed he was wearing her down, but in truth, he was forging her will like steel. And for the first time in years, Clara began to sense something dangerous in him. Not just the cruelty she had always known, but fear. Fear that she might outlast him. Fear that one day she would emerge. Above ground, Edward's mask still held, for now. But masks crack under the weight of time, and in the shadows below, Clara was learning how to push. The nail was nothing more than a rusted shard of metal, bent and dull from years of disuse. To Edward, it was worthless. To Clara, it was hope made tangible. She held it in her palm for hours after discovering it, running her thumb along its jagged edge, feeling the weight of possibility. In that cold, airless chamber, it was the first object she owned that was truly hers, and with it came choice. Her first use of the nail was simple: writing. No longer limited to the fragile scraps of paper Edward sometimes allowed, she now carved directly into the stone walls. Names, dates, fragments of memory, her mother's lullabies, her childhood prayers, even single words like freedom and vengeance. The nail etched her existence into the walls themselves, a testimony that could not be erased even if Edward discovered it. For the first time, she felt permanence. She was not invisible anymore. She was leaving marks the earth itself would remember. But her second use of the nail was far bolder. At night, when Edward's footsteps had long since faded and the house above was silent, she pressed it into the lock of the iron door. She did not yet know how to manipulate its mechanism, but she listened to the subtle clicks and groans of metal against metal. She traced its edges, learned the depth of its teeth, the tightness of its hold. Each attempt ended in failure, but each failure taught her something new. Clara was not just waiting anymore. She was rehearsing escape. And yet every movement came with danger. The sound of scraping could carry upward. If Edward suspected, the nail would be gone, and her one weapon stolen back. So she trained herself to work in silence, muffling the noise with cloth, pausing at every creak of the floorboards above. Her heart thundered with every attempt, but the fear no longer paralyzed her, it fueled her. Still, she knew she could not rush. Edward's paranoia had sharpened his eyes. Some nights he searched her chamber without warning, his hands raking through her bedding, his lamp sweeping across the floor. Each time she sat motionless, feigning emptiness, hiding the nail in a crack so deep he would never find it. And each time he left, muttering that she was harmless, she bit down on the smile threatening to break across her face. Because she knew a truth he never could. Every cage has a weakness. And now, in her hand, Clara held the first tool to find it. Clara's chamber had once been a tomb, but now in secret she was reshaping it into a workshop of resistance. The nails scratched deeper lines into the stone, not just words but maps, sketches of the door, diagrams of the lock, symbols only she understood. She was turning her prison into a record of her strategy, a place where her thoughts could live outside her body, and with each line carved, she reclaimed a fragment of herself. But something else began to change. Edward noticed it. He couldn't put it into words, but he felt it in her eyes. For years, she had looked at him with hollow obedience, the empty stare of someone broken. Now, though she bowed her head and whispered his mantras, there was something alive beneath the surface, a quiet spark, a patience too deliberate to be despair. And Edward, though he told himself he was master, felt unease coil in his gut. It was in small things. When he entered, she no longer flinched. When he spoke, she no longer trembled. Her silence was too composed, too measured. He searched her chamber more often now, running his hands across the walls, overturning her bedding, staring into the shadows as if the stone itself mocked him. He found nothing, of course. Clara had hidden the nail so well that even desperation could not expose it, but suspicion gnawed at him all the same. To test her, he tightened the leash. He cut her meals in half, leaving her weaker, expecting collapse. He left her in darkness for 3 straight days, believing fear would soften her resolve. When he finally returned, lamp casting yellow light across her gaunt face, he expected pleading. Instead, she met his gaze and whispered, "The world is poison. Here, I am safe." The words were his, but the tone was hers. Calm, measured, almost mocking. He told himself she was still his creation, still obedient, but deep down he knew. The words no longer belonged to him. They had become her mask, her weapon. That night, Edward lingered longer than usual outside the iron door, listening for any sound. And though Clara sat in silence, clutching the nail in her hand, she knew the balance between them had shifted. For the first time, Edward feared her. Fear corrodes the mind, and in Edward Hensley it festered like rot. For years he had convinced himself that he was master of the chamber, priest of this private faith, keeper of a daughter-turned-disciple. But mastery is fragile when built on lies, and Edward had begun to sense the cracks. He told himself he still controlled Clara, but his actions betrayed him. His sermons grew longer, harsher, desperate attempts to reinforce the very obedience he no longer believed in. He began withholding food for longer stretches, sometimes days, until Clara's stomach burned with emptiness. He locked her in darkness not for hours but for weeks, believing the silence itself would crush her mind. And when he entered, lamp in hand, his voice no longer carried calm conviction. It carried panic. He would seize her wrist, hold her face in his hands, searching her eyes for defiance. "Say it again," he demanded. "Say the world is poison. Say you belong to me." And she did, always in the same quiet, steady voice. To Edward it sounded like submission, but beneath the surface it was rehearsal. Every word sharpened her patience like a blade. Every deprivation hardened her endurance. Hunger became training. Darkness became meditation. Pain became proof that she could survive anything he threw at her. The more Edward tightened his grip, the more he revealed his weakness. Clara saw it in the way his hands shook when he unlocked the door, in the way sweat beaded on his forehead even in the cool cellar air. He was aging. He was unraveling. And though he still believed she was caged by his will, Clara knew the truth. He was caged by his fear of losing her. She tested his desperation one night. When he demanded the mantra, she hesitated, letting silence stretch for 3 long seconds before speaking. His face twisted in rage, his body trembling, as if the pause had ripped open his worst nightmare. But then, when she finally whispered the words, he exhaled with relief so profound it bordered on collapse. In that moment, Clara realized the balance had fully shifted. He needed her compliance more than she feared his wrath. Above ground, Edward's mask crumbled further. Neighbors whispered about his absence from church, his neglect of the farm, the hollow look in his eyes. His performance was slipping, but no one dared confront him. The myth of the grieving father still shielded him, even as the monster beneath grew frantic. And below, in the chamber he had built to erase her, Clara smiled in the dark. His cruelty no longer broke her, it built her. By the 13th year of her captivity, Clara had learned the architecture of Edward's mind better than he understood it himself. She had mapped the contours of his paranoia, the rhythm of his rages, the fragile cracks in the armor he wore when he descended into the chamber. To survive had once been her goal. Now survival was merely the foundation. She was learning to conquer. Edward entered one evening with the same trembling authority, his oil lamp casting grotesque shadows against the stone. "Say it," he demanded, voice rising. "Say the world is poison. Say you belong to me." Clara lowered her eyes and whispered, "The world is poison." But then, deliberately, she let her voice falter on the second line. She let silence linger like a dagger. Edward froze, every muscle tightening. His pupils widened with panic, his breathing grew shallow. Clara watched him crumble over 3 seconds of pause. She had discovered his true prison, the terror of losing her obedience. She began to use it. Small hesitations, subtle changes in tone, the occasional refusal to meet his gaze. Each time, Edward unraveled a little more. He paced, shouted, pleaded, cursed. And when she finally relented and repeated the words, his collapse was visible, shoulders slumping, eyes wet, as if he had been dragged to the brink of madness and pulled back only by her mercy. Edward thought he was disciplining Clara. In truth, Clara was training Edward. She was rewriting the script of their ritual, making him dependent on her performance. What had once been his weapon became her leverage. Upstairs, his paranoia seeped into the community. He withdrew even further, refusing visits, snapping at those who asked questions. The myth of the grieving father was fraying. Rumors spread like frost across Greene County fields, that Edward drank too much, that his mind was slipping, that his adopted children seemed strangely guarded around him. He heard the whispers in town, and each one fed his dread. He returned to Clara's chamber to unload his fears, pacing like a penitent before her, confessing the dangers of the outside world. And though he didn't see it, Clara's lips curled into the faintest smile. He was feeding her everything she needed, his weaknesses, his doubts, the lies he told himself. The chamber he built to erase her had become her throne of shadows, and Edward, the jailer, was becoming her subject. Edward came to her more often now, not as a master, but as a man hunted by his own shadow. His lamp would rattle in his hand as he set it down, his sermons unraveling into frantic monologues. He spoke less about Clara's obedience and more about the neighbors, the whispers, the dangers of exposure, and Clara listened. She had learned the sacred art of silence, the silence that makes men pour out their souls. When he demanded the ritual, she complied, but with new softness in her tone, as if she pitied him. Sometimes she let her voice tremble just slightly, feigning weakness. Edward mistook it for devotion renewed. He didn't see that each crack she performed was a blade turning inward on his conscience. One night, she whispered after the chant, "Do you ever wonder if they're right? If the world really is poisoned? Why are you the only one who sees it?" The words slid into his mind like smoke. He snapped at her, barked for silence, but his hands shook so violently that the lamp nearly fell. Clara had found her opening. She began weaving small questions into their encounters, never direct rebellion, always cloaked in innocence. Why do the children upstairs grow sick if the world outside is worse? Or, if God cursed everything, why did he leave you standing alone? She asked them softly in the tone of a disciple seeking guidance, but each was a seed of doubt planted in the soil of his paranoia. Edward's replies grew unhinged. He shouted scripture, half-remembered, twisted into threats. Sometimes he wept, clutching his head. Sometimes he pressed his palm to Clara's mouth, as if trying to block the questions before they could infect him, yet the infection had already begun. The truth was that Edward had built his religion to excuse himself, to sanctify the cruelty he inflicted. But Clara had flipped it. With each question she made him look not at her, but at himself. The poison he warned her of was in his veins. The curse he preached of was written on his own conscience. And while Edward staggered under the weight of unspoken guilt, Clara remained steady. She had learned patience in the dark. Now she used it as a weapon, knowing that a whispered word, repeated enough, could carve cracks into a fortress stone by stone. Edward still thought himself the keeper of the chamber, but Clara knew the truth. The chamber had become his confessional, and she was the priest to whom he spilled his sins. Sleep deserted Edward Hensley. Nights stretched long and airless in the farmhouse above, filled with phantom sounds, floorboards creaking when no one walked, voices whispering through the walls, the faint ring of a bell he had buried years ago in the cellar. He drank more to silence them, but the whiskey only blurred the edges, leaving gaps for dread to crawl through. Sometimes he woke with his hands around his own throat, gasping as if strangled by invisible fingers. He told no one. Instead, he carried his terror into the chamber. Clara could smell the drink on him before he spoke, could see the pallor of his face, the swollen veins around his eyes. His sermons had become frantic, stitched together with fragments of scripture and curses. He no longer demanded obedience with confidence, he begged for it with desperation. "Say it," he whispered once, his voice cracking like glass. "Say you belong to me. Say it before they hear us." Clara tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Who hears us, Father?" she asked in a soft, almost innocent voice. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted to the dark corners of the chamber. For the first time, he looked afraid not of her, but of something else lurking unseen. She pressed him further. "Is it the poisoned ones? Are they calling for me?" The words struck him like a hammer. He staggered back, nearly dropping the lamp, muttering about spirits, about the devil creeping into her tongue. Clara remained perfectly still, her face calm, but inside she thrilled at the sight. She had taken his delusion and given it form. Now, every flicker of shadow, every echo in the cellar, could feel to Edward like confirmation. Within days, his hallucinations grew. He swore he saw Clara moving in the dark even when she sat motionless. Once, he accused her of whispering when her lips hadn't moved at all. Another time, he rushed into the chamber, sweating and shaking, insisting that they were clawing at the doors, trying to take her away. Clara listened, eyes wide, as though sharing his terror, but in truth she was guiding it. Each question she asked, each silence she allowed, shaped his madness further. The man who once ruled by fear was now ruled by it. The jailer could no longer tell whether the chamber kept Clara in or whether it kept his demons out. And in that shifting of power, Clara saw her path, to let him destroy himself from within, piece by piece, until the walls he built became his tomb. The farmhouse grew haunted, not by spirits, but by Edward's mind unraveling. Neighbors heard shouts in the night, the slam of doors, the crack of wood against stone. They whispered that grief had finally driven him mad, but no one dared press further. Within the house, the children learned to step lightly, to avoid his gaze, to swallow their laughter lest it spark his fury. Edward had become a storm with no pattern, lashing out at shadows no one else could see. In the chamber, the violence was worse. He began bringing a cane with him, not to strike Clara, but to strike at the walls. Each visit he swung wildly into the darkness, smashing stone and wood, as though he could drive away the unseen forces closing in on him. The echoes thundered through the chamber like cannon fire, dust falling from the beams above. Clara sat still, her face blank, watching him waste his strength on ghosts. Once he turned suddenly, eyes bloodshot, sweat pouring down his temples. "They want you," he hissed. "They whisper your name. Do you hear them? Tell me you don't hear them." Clara let her lips part slightly as if torn by fear and whispered, "I only hear you, Father." The words soothed him like balm. His shaking slowed, his shoulders sagged. For a moment he almost looked at peace. That was her weapon now. Not resistance, not defiance, but comfort. She gave it sparingly, in measured doses, so that Edward began to crave it. The man who once demanded obedience now sought reassurance. He needed her voice to calm the chaos in his head. Without it, he was lost. Clara understood the reversal fully the night he fell to his knees before her. He had raged for hours, pacing and cursing, striking at the walls until his arms trembled. Then, without warning, he dropped the cane, dropped the lamp, and collapsed at her feet. His voice broke into sobs. "They won't leave me," he cried. "God forgive me, they won't leave me." Clara bent toward him, her eyes calm in the dim glow. "Then let me pray for you," she whispered, and she began to murmur words he could not quite hear, words that sounded like scripture but were not, words that slipped into his ear like a lullaby laced with poison. For the first time, Edward surrendered not as master, but as supplicant. And in that surrender, Clara knew she had claimed the one power he could never reclaim, the power to decide whether he would endure another night or drown in his own fear. Edward's world no longer obeyed the rules of daylight. Even under the sun he saw shadows moving across the fields, shapes darting at the edge of vision. He spoke less to his neighbors, avoided town entirely, and wandered the farm as if patrolling a battlefield. But the chamber remained his axis, the place he both feared and needed. Each descent down the stone steps was a pilgrimage. Each return to Clara, a ritual that blurred the line between punishment and worship. She no longer looked to him like a daughter. The years of confinement had stripped away her youth, left her pale, skeletal yet radiant in the way of something unbroken. To Edward's mind she seemed untouched by time, a figure both eternal and accusatory. He began to call her by strange names. Sometimes, my lamb, sometimes my curse, sometimes angel. Once kneeling in the dust before her, he whispered, "Mother," as if she were both womb and grave. Clara never corrected him. She let the titles shift, let his delusions knot themselves tighter around her image. When he raved about spirits clawing at the doors, she told him softly, "They are afraid of me." His breath caught, his hands trembled. He searched her eyes, terrified and awed, as if he finally believed she was something more than mortal. From that night on, he treated her less as prisoner and more as oracle. He begged her to tell him what the voices wanted, what God demanded, whether his sins could be forgiven. She offered only fragments, whispers that sounded like comfort but lingered like judgment. "The voices are not your enemy," she told him once. "They are the weight you buried." Another night, she whispered, "Forgiveness waits in the dark." The words haunted him, though he did not understand them. He muttered them upstairs at the table, frightening the children with his vacant stare. He scratched them into the wood of his desk, scrawled them onto scraps of parchment. His mind circled endlessly around Clara's phrases, unable to escape their gravity. For Clara, this was victory. She had ascended from captive to confessor, from victim to phantom of his own conscience. The chamber he had built to bury her had instead birthed a figure in his mind he could not master. A figure that could be saint or demon depending on her whisper. And though she had not yet touched a weapon, Clara held the deadliest blade of all, his belief. The chamber had grown colder with time, its walls sweating with damp, the air heavy with mildew and whispers. Edward's lamp burned lower each night, its flames sputtering as though mocking the last threads of his sanity. He was gaunt now, his once proud frame bent, his eyes ringed in bruised shadows. He no longer descended as a master, but stumbled like a penitent, clutching the railing, clutching his cane, clutching the very darkness he once commanded. That night Clara waited in silence as he entered. She no longer needed to feign obedience. He fell to his knees before her without asking, his cane clattering across the stones. His lips moved in feverish prayer, but no words came out, only broken sobs. At last he looked up, and in his eyes there was no cruelty left, only terror. "Tell me what they want," he pleaded. "Tell me how to silence them." Clara leaned forward, her face still and calm, her voice low and steady. "They do not want silence," she whispered. "They want truth." Edward flinched as if struck. "Truth," he rasped. "What truth?" Her gaze never wavered. "That the poison you spoke of was never outside these walls. It was in you. You buried me to hide from it, but it followed you. It grew. It whispers because you never confessed." He shook his head violently, sweat flying from his brow. "No, no. God gave me the vision. He showed me the rot." His voice cracked. "I saved you. I saved you from it." Clara's whisper cut through him like a blade. "No, Edward. You saved yourself. You built this chamber not to protect me, but to cage the truth. And now it cages you." The words echoed against stone, growing louder in his mind until they became the voices he could no longer bear. He staggered back, clutching his ears, muttering denials, striking his head against the wall as if he could smash her voice out of existence. But Clara did not move. She only repeated, calm and relentless, "The chamber is yours, Edward, not mine." Something broke inside him. He dropped to the floor, writhing, gasping for breath. His hands clawed at the stones, his face twisting as though every ghost he had ever buried now pressed against him. He screamed, not at Clara but at himself, at the phantoms of his own guilt, and then in one final act of madness he seized his cane and drove its jagged end into his own chest, collapsing in a pool of silence. Clara did not cry out, she only watched as the life drained from him, the man who had stolen hers finally undone by the truths he had tried to bury. For the first time in 18 years, the chamber was quiet. Not oppressive, not suffocating, quiet like release. Clara inhaled deeply, the air of freedom tasting like fire in her lungs. The door above still waited, heavy and barred, but Edward was gone, and his prison had become his tomb. And in that darkness, Clara smiled. The silence stretched long after Edward's body stilled, as if the chamber itself were holding its breath. For 18 years Clara had listened to the drip of water, the scrape of locks, the shuffle of boots on stone. Now there was nothing, no voice demanding obedience, no footsteps pacing in frenzy, no lamp trembling in the dark. Only the hush of freedom waiting at the edges of her awareness. She rose slowly, her bones stiff, her muscles trembling from years of confinement. The chamber, once her tomb, felt smaller now, as though it had shrunk under the weight of Edward's death. She stepped past his body without a glance. He was no longer master, no longer tormentor, only flesh cooling on the stones. The door above loomed, heavy, barred, but Edward had not locked it behind him. She climbed the stairs, her fingers brushing the damp walls, each step echoing like a drumbeat of resurrection. At the top, she pushed. The wood groaned, then yielded. Light, real light, spilled across her face for the first time in nearly 2 decades. It burned. Her eyes watered, her skin prickled. She stumbled forward, falling onto the floorboards of the farmhouse she had last seen as a child. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of sunlight. The air smelled of earth and grass, so sharp and alive it cut her lungs. She lay there, gasping, drinking in the world she had been denied. The children upstairs stirred at the noise. They crept to the stairs, wide-eyed, whispering. They had known of the locked door, had heard muffled sounds from below, but never dared ask. Now they saw her, a woman pale as bone, thin as a wraith, crawling from the darkness. For a heartbeat they froze in terror. Then the youngest whispered, "Clara?" Her name, her true name, spoken not as a command, not as a curse, but as recognition. Her chest tightened. For years she had been stripped of identity, reduced to nothing but obedience. Now the sound of her name was salvation. She rose to her knees, sunlight warming her face, and for the first time since childhood, Clara smiled without fear. The chamber was behind her. The world, vast, poisoned or not, was ahead, and whatever came next, it would belong to her. They called it the Hensley farm for years after, though the name carried a weight no one wished to speak aloud. Neighbors whispered of strange sounds that had once drifted from the cellar, of Edward's hollow eyes, and the way he withered before their sight. When his body was finally found, slumped against the stones of his own chamber, it was said his face bore the look of a man who had been judged, not by any court of men, but by something older, deeper, and far less merciful. And Clara, she emerged not as victim, but as survivor. To some she was a ghost in daylight, too thin, too pale, a woman who had lived longer in darkness than in sun. To others she was living proof that the soul could not be broken, even under years of chains. They avoided her in the streets at first, unsettled by the calm in her eyes, the quiet in her steps, the way she seemed to see through the world instead of into it. But whispers turned to reverence. She had endured what no one else could. Legends grew around her. Some swore she carried the curse Edward had feared, that the poison lived in her veins and spared her only because she belonged to it. Others believed she was something closer to divine, touched by the hand of suffering and sharpened into a figure of judgment. Children dared each other. To walk past the old farmhouse at night, to glimpse the boarded windows, to feel the chill that lingered in the soil. But the truth was simpler and darker. Clara had not been saved by angels or cursed by devils. She had survived because Edward gave her every tool to endure. Hunger as discipline, silence as meditation, pain as armor. He forged the very weapon that destroyed him. And when the time came, she used it. Not with steel or flame, but with words. The same words he once forced upon her. The chamber still stands, its stones damp and cold, its air heavy with the weight of memory. Some say if you descend into its depths and whisper your name, you'll hear another voice echo back. Not Edward's, but Clara's, calm and steady, reminding you that walls cannot hold truth forever. And if you listen long enough, you'll hear the real secret, that the most dangerous prisons are not made of stone, but of the lies we tell ourselves to hide from guilt. Edward built such a prison, and in the end it buried him.